Ben stood outside the church, staring at the cream-colored invitation in his hands. The paper was slightly wrinkled from being folded and unfolded so many times over the past 3 weeks. He had almost thrown it away twice, once into his kitchen trash and another time into the office shredder. Each time, something stopped him. Maybe it was loyalty to Mike, his childhood friend. Maybe it was the fear that avoiding this day would make everything worse. The morning sun felt warm on his face, but inside his chest, everything felt cold and heavy. Today was the day his best friend would marry the only woman Ben had ever truly loved. Emma would become Mrs. Mike Rodriguez in less than 2 hours, and Ben would have to sit there and smile like his heart wasn't breaking into 1,000 pieces. He checked his watch. 10 minutes until the ceremony started. He could still leave. He could drive home, call Mike later with some excuse about being sick, and spend the day pretending this wedding wasn't happening. But that would make him a coward, and Ben had been a coward long enough. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the church entrance. The old building looked beautiful with white roses and ribbons decorating the doorway. Emma had always loved white roses. He remembered the day she planted a white rose bush in her backyard when they were teenagers. She had pricked her finger on a thorn and Ben had run to get her a bandage, worried about the tiny drop of blood like it was a major emergency. Ben Miller. He turned to see Mrs. Chen walking slowly up the church steps. She was wearing a navy blue dress and carrying a small purse. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and she looked more formal than he had ever seen her. Mrs. Chen had lived next door to his family for about 15 years, ever since he was in high school. She was a quiet woman who kept to herself most of the time, though she always waved when she saw him. Mrs. Chen, Ben said, surprised. I didn't know you knew Mike. She smiled, but something in her expression seemed different. Nervous, maybe. I know Emma, she said simply. I wanted to be here for her special day. That was odd. Ben couldn't remember Emma ever mentioning being close to Mrs. Chen. In fact, Emma had lived 3 houses down from Ben, which meant she was even further from Mrs. Chen's house. How well could they really know each other? That's nice of you, Ben said, not knowing what else to say. Mrs. Chen nodded and walked inside ahead of him. Ben followed, his shoes making soft sounds on the church's wooden floor. The sanctuary was filling up with guests. On the left side sat Mike's family and friends, talking and laughing quietly. On the right side were Emma's people. Ben recognized some faces from high school and from the neighborhood, but Emma's side seemed smaller than Mike's. Emma had never talked much about her family. Ben knew she was adopted, but she rarely mentioned her adoptive parents and seemed to prefer not discussing it. Ben found a seat in the back row on Mike's side. He wanted to be able to leave quickly when the ceremony was over. The last thing he wanted was to get trapped in long conversations about how beautiful the wedding was or how happy the couple looked. From his seat, he could see Mrs. Chen sitting about 5 rows ahead of him, but on Emma's side. That struck him as even more strange. If she knew Emma well enough to sit with her family and friends, why had Ben never seen them together? In all the years of living next door to Mrs. Chen, and all the time he had spent with Emma, their paths should have crossed more often. The organ music began to play, and everyone stood. Ben's stomach twisted as he watched Mike walk down the aisle with his parents. Mike looked happy and excited, straightening his tie and grinning at friends in the crowd. Ben tried to feel happy for his friend, but mostly he just felt sick. Then the wedding march started, and Ben's breath caught in his throat. Emma appeared at the back of the church, arm in arm with her adoptive father, Mr. Thompson. She looked absolutely beautiful in her white dress, her dark hair styled in an elegant updo with small white flowers woven through it. Those were gardenias, Ben realized. Emma had always said gardenias were her favorite flowers, even though she had never known why. As Emma walked down the aisle, Ben found himself remembering their childhood together. Emma's family had moved to Maple Street when Ben was 12 and she was 11. She had been shy at first, standing alone in her new backyard while her parents unpacked boxes. Ben had climbed over the fence separating their yards and introduced himself. That was the beginning of 7 years of friendship that had meant everything to him. They had spent countless summer afternoons sitting under the old oak tree in Emma's backyard, talking about everything and nothing. Emma would tell him about the books she was reading, and Ben would share his dreams of becoming a teacher. When they got older, their conversations became deeper. Emma would wonder about her birth parents and why they had given her up for adoption. Ben would listen, wishing he could somehow make that sadness in her eyes go away. The night before Emma left for college in a different state, they had sat on her back porch until 3 in the morning. Ben had wanted to tell her how he felt, wanted to say that he had been in love with her for years. But Emma was excited about her new life, talking about all the things she wanted to do and see. Ben couldn't bring himself to complicate things for her. Instead, he told her he would miss her and made her promise to stay in touch. They had stayed in touch, at first. Phone calls every few weeks, emails, letters during her first year. But gradually, life got in the way. Emma made new friends, started dating, got busy with her studies. Ben finished college, started his teaching job, and tried to move on. When Emma graduated and took a job in the city, 2 hours away from their hometown, Ben thought that was the end of their story. But then, 6 months ago, Emma had moved back to town. She had gotten a job at the local hospital as a nurse and had rented a small apartment downtown. Ben had run into her at the grocery store on her second week back, and it was like no time had passed at all. They started meeting for coffee, taking walks in the park, falling back into their old easy friendship. Except it wasn't quite the same for Ben. Seeing Emma again had brought back all those old feelings, stronger than ever. She was still beautiful, still kind, still the person who could make him laugh even on his worst days. And Ben was still too much of a coward to tell her how he felt. Then Emma had started dating Mike. Mike was a good guy, a contractor who had his own business and treated Emma well. Ben had introduced them, actually, at a barbecue at his parents' house. He had watched them hit it off and had smiled and acted supportive even while his heart was breaking. Now, 6 months later, here they were. Emma was walking down the aisle to marry Mike, and Ben was sitting in the back row, trying not to fall apart. As Emma reached the front of the church, Ben noticed that Mrs. Chen was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap. But she was staring at Emma with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone who was supposed to be just a neighbor who barely knew the bride. Ben had always found Mrs. Chen to be a bit mysterious. She had moved to Maple Street without much explanation, buying the house from the elderly couple who had lived there before. She didn't seem to have any family who visited, and she rarely talked about her past. She worked part-time at the library and kept a beautiful garden, but beyond that, Ben knew very little about her life. What he did know was that Mrs. Chen seemed to pay attention to everything that happened on their street. Not in a nosy way, exactly, but more like she was always watching. Ben had noticed it over the years. When Emma had come home from college for visits, Mrs. Chen would happen to be working in her front yard. When Emma moved back to town permanently, Ben had seen Mrs. Chen standing at her living room window, looking down the street toward Emma's old house. At the time, Ben had assumed Mrs. Chen was just curious about the neighborhood activities. But now, watching her at the wedding, he wondered if there was more to it. The officiant began the ceremony, and Ben tried to focus on the words. But his mind kept wandering. He thought about all the times he had almost told Emma how he felt. The night she came back to town, when they were sitting on a park bench and she mentioned how good it felt to be home. The morning they ran into each other at the farmer's market, and she laughed at something he said and touched his arm. Last month, when she called him upset about a difficult day at work, and he had gone over to her apartment with ice cream and spent the evening listening to her talk. Each time, he had chickened out. He told himself that Emma was happy, that she was building a new life, that she didn't need him complicating things. He told himself that their friendship was too important to risk. But really, he was just scared of being rejected. Now it was too late. Emma was about to become someone else's wife, and Ben would have to find a way to live with the knowledge that he had never even tried. The officiant was talking about love and commitment, about the importance of supporting each other through good times and bad. Ben tried not to listen too closely. The words were too painful, knowing they were meant for Emma and Mike, not for him. He glanced around the church, trying to distract himself. Most of the guests were focused on the ceremony, smiling as they watched the happy couple. But Mrs. Chen looked different. Her face was serious, almost sad, and she kept glancing around nervously like she was waiting for something. Ben wondered again why she was really here. In all his years of knowing her, Mrs. Chen had never mentioned being close to Emma. She had never even mentioned knowing Emma beyond the casual way neighbors know each other. Yet here she was, dressed up for the wedding, sitting with Emma's family and friends, looking like she had something important on her mind. The ceremony continued, and Ben found himself lost in memories again. He remembered teaching Emma how to ride a bike when they were kids, running behind her and holding onto the seat until she was ready to go on her own. He remembered the day she had gotten stung by a bee and he had carried her piggyback to his house so his mom could take care of her. He remembered high school graduation, when Emma had hugged him and said he was the best friend anyone could ask for. Best friend. That was all he had ever been to her, and all he ever would be. The officiant's voice brought Ben back to the present moment. They were getting close to the part of the ceremony he was dreading most, the vows. Ben wasn't sure he could sit through Emma promising to love Mike forever without completely falling apart. But as the officiant began to speak about the importance of honesty and truth in marriage, Mrs. Chen shifted in her seat. Ben watched as she took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, like she was preparing herself for something difficult. Ben had a strange feeling that this wedding was about to become much more complicated than anyone expected. The officiant cleared his throat and looked out at the gathered guests. His voice was warm and ceremonial as he spoke the traditional words. If anyone here has a reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. Ben held his breath. This was always the most awkward part of any wedding ceremony. Everyone knew it was just a formality, a leftover tradition from older times. No one ever actually stood up and objected. The few seconds of silence would pass, and the ceremony would continue. But as Ben watched, Mrs. Chen slowly began to rise from her seat. The movement was so unexpected that Ben thought maybe she was just adjusting her position or reaching for something. But Mrs. Chen continued standing until she was fully upright. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was clear and strong when she spoke. "Don't look at the bride, look at me." The church fell completely silent. Ben felt his heart stop beating for a moment. Every head in the sanctuary turned to stare at the elderly woman standing in the fifth row. Emma's mouth fell open in shock. Mike looked confused and concerned. The officiant blinked several times, clearly not knowing how to handle this situation. Mrs. Chen's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Emma, dear child, I need you to look at me. Really look at me." Emma turned in her wedding dress, the beautiful white fabric rustling softly. Her face was pale with confusion and surprise. "Mrs. Chen. I don't understand. What's happening?" Ben watched in amazement as Mrs. Chen stepped out into the aisle. She moved slowly, but with purpose, like she had been planning this moment for a very long time. "My name is not just Mrs. Chen," the elderly woman said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church. "My full name is Margaret Chen Wilson. 50 years ago, my last name was Wilson. And 50 years ago, I gave birth to a baby girl that I had to give up for adoption." Ben felt the pieces clicking together in his mind like a puzzle finally being solved. Emma's birth date. The way Mrs. Chen always seemed to be watching. The mysterious way she had appeared in the neighborhood all those years ago. Emma's adoptive father, Mr. Thompson, gasped audibly. Mrs. Thompson put her hand over her mouth. Emma just stared at Mrs. Chen, her wedding bouquet shaking in her hands. "Emma," Mrs. Chen continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, "you are my granddaughter." The church erupted in whispers and gasps. Ben heard someone behind him say, "Oh my goodness," and another person whisper, "I can't believe this." But his eyes stayed focused on Emma, whose face had gone from confusion to shock to something that looked like hope. "Your birth mother," Mrs. Chen said, walking slowly closer to the front of the church, "was my daughter, Sarah Wilson. She was 19 years old when she had you, and she was not married. This was 1975, and things were very different then. Sarah was scared and felt like she had no choices." Ben remembered Emma talking about wondering who her birth parents were, especially her birth mother. She had always imagined different scenarios, different reasons why she might have been given up for adoption. She had never known that the answers to her questions were living just a few houses away. "Sarah wanted to keep you," Mrs. Chen continued, now standing at the end of Emma's row. "She loved you so much, even before you were born. But I was a single mother myself, working 2 jobs just to support Sarah. We lived in a tiny apartment, and I was barely making ends meet. When Sarah told me she was pregnant, I panicked." Emma's hand went to her throat, and Ben could see that she was crying now. Mike moved closer to her, putting his arm around her shoulders, but Emma seemed barely aware of anything except Mrs. Chen's words. "I convinced Sarah that giving you to a good family would be the best thing for everyone," Mrs. Chen said, her voice breaking. "The adoption agency found the Thompsons, and they seemed perfect. They had been trying to have a baby for years, and they had a nice house and stable jobs. I told Sarah it was the right thing to do." Mr. Thompson stood up from his seat in the front row. His face was kind but confused. "Mrs. Chen, we had no idea. The adoption was handled through an agency. We never knew anything about Emma's birth family." "I know," Mrs. Chen said, nodding. "I asked them not to give you any information about us. I thought it would be easier for everyone if there was no contact. But I was wrong about that. I was wrong about so many things." Ben watched Emma's face as she processed this information. She looked overwhelmed, like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "What happened to my mother?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to Sarah?" Mrs. Chen closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "Sarah got married 2 years after you were born. She had 2 more children, your half-brother and half-sister. She became a teacher, and she was very happy. But she never stopped missing you. She never stopped wondering if she had made the right choice." "Where is she now?" Emma asked. "She died in a car accident 8 years ago," Mrs. Chen said softly. "She was on her way home from her daughter's graduation." "Your half-sister's graduation?" Emma made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Mike tightened his arm around her, and Ben felt his own eyes filling with tears. He had never seen Emma look so heartbroken and hopeful at the same time. "Before she died," Mrs. Chen continued, "Sarah made me promise something. She made me promise that I would find you someday and tell you that giving you up was the hardest thing she ever did, but also that she never regretted it because she knew you would have a good life with people who could love you properly." Ben realized that his own hands were shaking. The whole church seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to hear what would happen next. "I tried to find you for years," Mrs. Chen said. "But adoption records were sealed, and I didn't have much information to go on. Then, about 15 years ago, I hired a private investigator. He found out that you had been adopted by the Thompsons and that you lived on Maple Street. So I moved here." Emma's eyes widened. "You moved here because of me?" "I bought the house on your street so I could be near you," Mrs. Chen admitted. "I told myself I would just watch from a distance, make sure you were okay, and maybe someday find the courage to introduce myself. But years kept passing, and I kept finding reasons to wait." Ben thought about all those times he had seen Mrs. Chen in her yard when Emma was around. All those coincidental encounters that hadn't been coincidental at all. Mrs. Chen had been watching Emma grow up from afar, knowing she was her granddaughter but never being able to say anything. "I watched you graduate from high school," Mrs. Chen said, smiling through her tears. "I was in the back of the auditorium, and I was so proud. I watched you leave for college, and I was so sad but also excited for your future. When you came back to town, I was happier than I had been in years. Emma was crying openly now, but she was also smiling. All those times I saw you in your garden, you were watching me. I was watching you, and I was loving you, Mrs. Chen said. I was being the grandmother I never got to be. When I heard you were getting married, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't let you start your new life without knowing that you have family who has always loved you. The officiant, who had been standing quietly through this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Perhaps we should take a few minutes to process this situation, he said gently. But Emma was already moving. She handed her bouquet to Mike and walked toward Mrs. Chen. When she reached her grandmother, she stopped for just a moment, looking into the older woman's eyes like she was trying to see her whole family history there. Then Emma wrapped her arms around Mrs. Chen, and both women started crying harder. The hug lasted for a long time, and Ben could see that neither of them wanted to let go. I always felt like something was missing, Emma whispered, loud enough for people nearby to hear. I always felt like there was more to my story. There is so much more, Mrs. Chen whispered back. I have pictures of your mother, and letters she wrote to you that she never sent. I have stories about your grandparents and your half-siblings. I have a whole lifetime of love that I've been saving for you. Ben felt like his heart was breaking and healing at the same time. This wasn't how he had expected this day to go, but watching Emma discover her family was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. Mike approached the two women carefully. Emma, he said softly, are you okay? Emma looked up at him, her face streaked with tears but glowing with happiness. Mike, this is my grandmother. My actual grandmother. Mike smiled, and Ben could see why Emma had fallen in love with him. His reaction wasn't anger or frustration about the wedding being interrupted. Instead, he looked genuinely happy for Emma. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Chen, Mike said, reaching out to shake her hand. I'm sorry we're meeting under such unusual circumstances. Mrs. Chen laughed, wiping her eyes with a tissue someone had handed her. I'm sorry for interrupting your wedding. I didn't plan it this way, but when the officiant asked if anyone had objections, I realized this was my moment. I couldn't let Emma get married without knowing she has family. Emma looked back and forth between Mike and Mrs. Chen, like she was trying to figure out how to balance this new information with the fact that she was supposed to be getting married. What do we do now? She asked. The officiant smiled kindly. We can take as much time as you need, he said. This is your day, and we want it to be perfect for you. Ben watched as Emma's adoptive parents approached. Mrs. Thompson was crying, and Mr. Thompson looked emotional but also relieved. We always wondered if this day might come, Mr. Thompson said to Mrs. Chen. We hoped that someday Emma might be able to connect with her birth family. You did a beautiful job raising her, Mrs. Chen replied. Sarah would have been so grateful to you. I am so grateful to you. Ben realized that this moment was changing everything, not just for Emma but for everyone who loved her. Mrs. Chen had waited 15 years for this chance, and now she finally had her granddaughter back. As Ben watched Emma hug her grandmother again, he felt something shift inside his own chest. For the first time all day, he wasn't thinking about his own broken heart. Instead, he was thinking about how incredible it was that love could find a way to bring people together, even after decades of separation. Emma finally had the missing piece of her family story, and Ben realized that maybe that was more important than anything else happening today. The church buzzed with quiet conversations as guests tried to process what had just happened. Ben watched from his seat as Emma stood between Mike and Mrs. Chen, holding both of their hands. Her wedding dress was slightly wrinkled from all the hugging, and her makeup was smudged from crying, but Ben had never seen her look happier. The officiant approached the small group at the front of the church. Emma, Mike, what would you like to do? We can continue with the ceremony whenever you're ready, or we can take more time if you need it. Emma looked at Mike with questioning eyes. Is it okay? I know this isn't how we planned our wedding day. Mike smiled and squeezed her hand. Emma, this is incredible. You just found your grandmother. Of course we should include her in our wedding. That is, if Mrs. Chen would like to stay. Mrs. Chen's face lit up. I would be honored to stay for your wedding. But only if you're sure I haven't ruined everything. You haven't ruined anything, Emma said firmly. You've made it perfect. Ben felt a strange warmth in his chest watching this scene unfold. Just an hour ago, he had been dreading this wedding, thinking it would be the worst day of his life. Now he was witnessing something beautiful and unexpected. Emma wasn't just gaining a husband today, she was gaining the family she had always wondered about. The officiant nodded. Then let's continue. Mrs. Chen, would you like to move to the front row? Mrs. Chen looked uncertain. I don't want to take anyone's place. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson immediately spoke up. Please, sit with us, Mrs. Thompson said warmly. You're Emma's family. You belong in the front row. As Mrs. Chen moved to sit with Emma's adoptive parents, Ben noticed something he hadn't seen before. Mrs. Thompson reached over and patted Mrs. Chen's hand gently. Mr. Thompson leaned over to say something that made Mrs. Chen smile. Even in this unexpected moment, Emma's adoptive parents were being kind and welcoming. It was clear they truly wanted what was best for Emma, even if it meant sharing her with newly discovered family. The ceremony resumed, but everything felt different now. There was an energy in the church that hadn't been there before, like everyone was witnessing something special beyond just a wedding. When Emma and Mike exchanged vows, Emma's voice was stronger and more confident than Ben had expected. She spoke about love, commitment, and building a future together, but she also added something that wasn't in their original vows. Mike, she said, looking into his eyes, today I'm not just gaining a husband. I'm discovering that love comes in so many forms, and that family can be found in the most unexpected places. I promise to remember this feeling of joy and surprise for the rest of our lives together. Mike's response was equally heartfelt. Emma, watching you meet your grandmother today has shown me something amazing about who you are. You have such capacity for love, and I feel lucky to be part of your story. I promise to support you as you build relationships with all the family who loves you. Ben found himself genuinely moved by their words. For the first time all day, he wasn't thinking about his own feelings for Emma. Instead, he was thinking about how mature and loving both Emma and Mike were being in this situation. They were handling an incredibly unexpected moment with grace and joy. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. But Ben noticed that the loudest cheers came from the front row, where Mrs. Chen was clapping enthusiastically while tears streamed down her face. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together, Emma stopped when she reached Mrs. Chen's row. She leaned down and whispered something to her grandmother that made the older woman smile broadly. Then Emma surprised everyone by taking off her wedding bouquet's ribbon and tying it around Mrs. Chen's wrist like a corsage. Now you're officially part of the wedding party, Emma said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Ben felt his eyes getting misty as he watched this gesture. Emma had always been thoughtful, but this was something special. She was making sure her grandmother felt truly included in one of the most important days of her life. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall. Ben had planned to make a quick appearance and then leave, but the atmosphere was so joyful that he found himself staying longer than expected. Mrs. Chen was sitting at the head table with Emma and Mike, looking slightly overwhelmed but incredibly happy. During dinner, Ben overheard conversations at nearby tables. People were talking about how amazing it was that Mrs. Chen had found Emma after all these years. Someone mentioned that it was like something out of a movie. Another person said they had never seen anything so touching at a wedding before. Ben realized that what had started as potentially the worst day of his life was turning into something he would never forget for completely different reasons. When it came time for speeches, Mike's best man spoke first, making jokes about Mike's bachelor days and expressing happiness for the new couple. Then Mr. Thompson stood up to give a father of the bride speech. Emma has always been our miracle child, Mr. Thompson said, his voice emotional. When we adopted her 27 years ago, we knew we were blessed. Today, we've been reminded that miracles can happen more than once in a lifetime. Mrs. Chen, thank you for sharing Emma with us all these years, even though we didn't know you were doing it. And thank you for choosing today to reveal yourself. Emma's joy is our joy. Mrs. Thompson dabbed at her eyes and nodded in agreement. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Chen asked if she could say a few words. She stood up slowly, looking nervous but determined. I never thought I would have the chance to speak at my granddaughter's wedding, she began, her voice shaking slightly. For 15 years, I have watched Emma from a distance, proud of every accomplishment, worried during every challenge, loving her from afar. Today, I am overwhelmed by the kindness of everyone here. You have welcomed me into this celebration even though I interrupted it in the most dramatic way possible. People laughed gently, and Mrs. Chen smiled. Emma, my dear child, your mother Sarah would be so proud of the woman you have become. She would love Mike, and she would be thrilled to see you so happy. I have letters from her that I will share with you, and photographs, and so many stories. But for now, I just want you to know that you have always been loved, even when you didn't know it. Mrs. Chen paused and looked around the room. And I want to thank the Thompsons for raising such a wonderful daughter. You gave her everything I couldn't, and I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt. Ben found himself clapping harder than he had for anything in a long time. As the evening continued, Ben watched Emma move around the reception, talking to guests, dancing with Mike, and spending time with Mrs. Chen. Every few minutes, Emma would reach over to touch her grandmother's hand or arm, like she needed to keep confirming that this wasn't a dream. Mrs. Chen seemed to be handling the attention well, though Ben could tell she was tired. This had to be emotionally exhausting for her too. She had carried the secret of Emma's identity for 15 years, and now everything was out in the open. During a quiet moment, Ben approached Mrs. Chen at her table. Mrs. Chen, he said, sitting down beside her. I wanted to tell you how brave I think you are. She looked at him with surprise. Brave? I felt like a coward for waiting so long. But you did it, Ben said. You found the courage when it mattered most. Emma needed to know about her family, and you made that happen. Mrs. Chen smiled thoughtfully. You know, Ben, I always noticed how kind you were to Emma when you were both young. You were a good friend to her. Ben felt a pang in his chest. I tried to be. She's lucky to have friends like you, Mrs. Chen continued. People who care about her happiness more than their own feelings. Ben looked at her sharply, wondering if she somehow knew about his feelings for Emma. But Mrs. Chen's expression was gentle and understanding, not judgmental. Love takes many forms, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back and let someone else make the person we care about happy. Ben felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't entirely sad tears. I just want her to be happy. I can see that, Mrs. Chen said. And she is happy. Look at her. Ben followed Mrs. Chen's gaze to where Emma was dancing with Mike. Emma was laughing at something Mike had whispered in her ear, and her face was glowing with joy. Ben realized that he had never seen her look quite like this before. This wasn't just happiness, this was completeness. You know, Mrs. Chen said, I think you played a more important role in Emma's life than you realize. What do you mean? If you hadn't introduced her to Mike, she wouldn't be marrying him today. If she hadn't come back to this town, I might never have found the courage to reveal myself. Sometimes we help create the very happiness we think we can't be part of. Ben sat with that thought for a moment. He had introduced Emma and Mike at his parents' barbecue. At the time, it had felt like the most painful thing he could do, but he had done it because he wanted Emma to meet good people and be happy. Now he wondered if Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe his role in Emma's story wasn't to be her romantic partner, but to be the connection that brought her to the people who would make her truly happy. As the reception wound down, Emma approached Ben near the exit. She looked tired but radiant. "Ben, I wanted to thank you," she said, giving him a warm hug. "Thank me? For what?" "For introducing me to Mike. For being such a good friend all these years. For always wanting what was best for me, even when it might not have been easy for you." Ben's heart skipped. Did Emma know about his feelings? "And," Emma continued, "for being the kind of person who helped me feel like I belonged somewhere, even when I didn't know where I came from. That mattered more than you know." Ben hugged her back, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "I'm so happy for you, Emma. Today was incredible." "It really was," Emma agreed. "I woke up this morning thinking I was just getting married. Now I'm married and I have a grandmother and I know about my mother and I have so much family I didn't know existed. It's overwhelming in the best possible way." "Mrs. Chen seems wonderful," Ben said. "She is. And Ben? She told me she's been watching over me for years. She said she noticed that I had good friends who cared about me, and that made her feel better about staying hidden for so long. So thank you for being one of those friends." As Ben drove home that night, he thought about everything that had happened. When he had woken up that morning, he had dreaded this day. He had expected to spend it nursing his broken heart and trying to hide his feelings. Instead, he had witnessed something beautiful. He had seen love in action in ways he hadn't expected. Mrs. Chen's love for Emma, spanning decades and distances. The Thompsons' love for Emma, generous enough to welcome her birth family. Mike's love for Emma, flexible enough to embrace surprises and changes. Emma's love for everyone around her, big enough to include new family members and old friends alike. Ben realized that his love for Emma didn't have to be painful or secret anymore. It could just be one of the many forms of love that surrounded her and supported her. He had helped bring her to this moment of happiness, and that was something to be proud of, not sad about. For the first time in months, Ben fell asleep easily, feeling grateful instead of heartbroken. Tomorrow, Emma would start her new life as a married woman with a newly discovered family. And Ben would continue being her friend, knowing that sometimes the most important role you can play in someone's story is helping them find their way to their own happy ending. The next morning, Ben woke up to find a text message from Emma. "Thank you for everything, Ben. You helped make yesterday perfect." Ben smiled and typed back, "Congratulations, Mrs. Rodriguez. You deserve all the happiness in the world." And for the first time in years, Ben truly meant it without any sadness at all.